The hunger gnawed at Willa Owens like a living thing inside her, a constant companion that had followed her through 3 days of deliberate cruelty. And as she stumbled through the dusty streets of Del Rio, Texas, in the scorching August heat of 1881, she wondered if this would be the day her legs finally gave out beneath her. Her husband Marcus had locked the pantry again, just as he had done countless times before, but this time he had taken all the keys with him when he left for his week-long cattle drive to San Antonio. The neighbors knew better than to interfere with Marcus Owens and his wife, having learned long ago that his temper was as fierce as a summer storm, and twice as unpredictable. Willa had tried to find work, tried to earn a few coins to buy bread, but in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, no one would hire a married woman without her husband's permission. The sun beat down mercilessly as she made her way toward the general store, hoping perhaps to beg for scraps, though the shame of it burned hotter than the Texas sun. The world tilted sideways suddenly, and Willa felt her knees buckle. She reached out for the hitching post outside the saloon, her fingers grasping at weathered wood as black spots danced across her vision. The street seemed to rise up to meet her, and she braced herself for the impact of hard-packed dirt against her face. Instead, strong arms caught her, steadying her weight with surprising gentleness. "Easy now, madam," a deep voice said, warm with concern. "I have got you." Willa blinked hard, trying to focus on the face above her. Dark hair fell across a sun-weathered brow, and eyes the color of creek water in springtime looked down at her with genuine worry. The man was tall, built solid like someone who earned his living through honest labor, and wore the dusty clothes of a working cowboy. A silver star gleamed on his vest. "When did you last eat?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only quiet observation. Willa tried to pull away, tried to summon the strength to stand on her own, but her body betrayed her. "I am fine," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. "You are not fine," he said firmly. "You are about to collapse in the middle of the street." He studied her face for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a hardening around his jaw that spoke of anger carefully controlled. "Come sit at my table now. The restaurant across the street serves decent food, and you need it more than I need the company." "I cannot," Willa said, though her stomach cramped at the very thought of food, at the promise of sustenance after days of emptiness. "My husband would not approve." The cowboy's eyes flickered with something dangerous, but when he spoke, his voice remained gentle. "Your husband is not here, and you are. I am Frank Ramsey, Deputy Sheriff of this town, and right now I am making sure one of our citizens does not die in the street." "There is nothing improper about that." He did not wait for her to argue further, simply guided her across the dusty road with one hand steady at her elbow, supporting more of her weight than she wanted to admit. The restaurant was blessedly cool inside, shaded by thick adobe walls, and the smell of cooking meat made Willa's head spin with longing and nausea in equal measure. Frank settled her into a chair at a corner table and signaled to the woman behind the counter. "Maria, bring us 2 plates of whatever you have hot and some bread right away." Maria Hernandez took one look at Willa's pale face and disappeared into the kitchen without a word. She returned moments later with a basket of warm tortillas and a bowl of beans, setting them on the table with a knowing glance at Frank. "Eat slowly," Frank said, pushing the basket toward Willa. "I know you are hungry, but your stomach needs time to adjust." Willa's hands shook as she reached for a tortilla, pride warring with desperate need. Pride lost. She tore off a small piece and brought it to her lips, and the simple taste of corn and salt was so overwhelming she felt tears spring to her eyes. She chewed carefully, swallowed, and felt the food settle heavily in her empty stomach. Frank did not watch her eat, giving her the dignity of his averted gaze while she worked through the tortilla with painful slowness. When Maria brought out plates of beef stew thick with vegetables, Willa thought she might weep from the kindness of it. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "No thanks needed," Frank replied, finally meeting her eyes again. "Though I would like to know why a married woman in my town is starving in the street." Willa looked down at her plate, shame and fear twisting together in her chest. She had spent 2 years hiding the truth of her marriage. 2 years making excuses for bruises and explaining away her husband's rages as the stress of ranch work and financial troubles. But sitting here in this cool adobe building with food in front of her and genuine concern in a stranger's eyes, the walls she had built around the truth began to crumble. "Marcus locks the pantry," she heard herself say. "When he is angry with me, which is often, he locks it and takes the keys. Usually he relents after a day, maybe 2. But this time he left for San Antonio with the cattle drive, and he took all the keys with him." Frank's hand tightened around his fork, knuckles going white. "How long has he been gone?" 4 days. "He will be back in 3 more. "And he left you with no food?" "None at all." Willa shook her head, taking another careful bite of stew. The warmth of it spread through her chest, easing the constant ache that had become her companion. Frank set down his fork deliberately, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with controlled fury. "That is not just cruelty, madam. That is attempted murder, plain and simple. A man who would starve his wife is a man who belongs in a jail cell, not running cattle to San Antonio." "He is my husband," Willa said automatically, the words worn smooth by repetition. "I made vows before God." "And he made vows too," Frank shot back. "To honor you, to cherish you, to protect you. Seems to me he broke those vows a long time ago." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those creek water eyes. "How long has this been going on?" Willa thought about lying, but found she did not have the energy for it anymore. "Since about 3 months after we married. 2 years now." Frank's jaw worked, and for a moment he looked away, staring out the window at the dusty street beyond. When he turned back, his expression had softened slightly. "I cannot arrest a man who is not in town, but I can make sure you are safe and fed until he returns. And when Marcus Owens comes back, he and I are going to have a very serious conversation about how men treat their wives in my town." "He will be angry," Willa said, old fear rising up to choke her. "Let him be angry. He can be angry in a jail cell." They finished their meal in silence, though Frank made sure to order extra food wrapped up for Willa to take with her. When they finally stood to leave, Willa felt steadier on her feet, the food beginning to restore some small measure of strength to her depleted body. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, painting the street in shades of gold and amber. Frank walked her back toward the small house at the edge of town that she shared with Marcus, but stopped a block away. "I do not think you should go back there," he said quietly. "Do you have anywhere else you could stay?" Willa thought of her sister in Louisiana, of the parents she had left behind in Tennessee when she married Marcus. They all seemed impossibly far away, separated not just by miles but by pride and shame and the weight of choices she could not undo. "I have nowhere," she admitted. Frank was quiet for a moment, considering. "There is a boarding house run by Mrs. Sarah Fletcher on the other side of town. She is a good woman, a widow, and she has a soft heart for people in trouble. I can talk to her, arrange for you to stay there until we sort this situation out. I have no money to pay her. Then we will figure something else out. Maybe you can help her with cooking or cleaning. Sarah is getting on in years, and I know she has been looking for someone to help her with the heavier work." He looked at her seriously. You do not have to go back to that house, Willa. You do not have to wait for him to come home and lock you up again. The use of her first name, spoken with such gentle familiarity, made something crack open inside Willa's chest. She realized that in 2 years of marriage, Marcus had rarely called her by her name, preferring instead to summon her with sharp commands or bitter epithets. Hearing her name spoken with kindness felt like a revelation. I do not know how to leave, she said honestly. I do not know how to do any of this. You do not have to know, Frank replied. You just have to take the first step. Let me help you with the rest. Willa looked at this man who was little more than a stranger, this deputy sheriff with his weathered face and kind eyes, and made a decision that she knew would change everything. All right, take me to Mrs. Fletcher. Sarah Fletcher's boarding house was a sprawling 2-story structure with a wide porch and flower boxes in the windows, incongruously cheerful in a town built on dust and determination. Mrs. Fletcher herself was a small, round woman with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had weathered her share of life's storms. Frank explained the situation in low tones while Willa waited on the porch, and she saw the older woman's expression harden with understanding and sympathy. When Sarah finally approached her, she took both of Willa's hands in her own work-roughened ones. My dear girl, she said simply, you are welcome here for as long as you need. Frank tells me you might be willing to help with some of the housework in exchange for your room and board. Yes, madam, Willa said. I am a hard worker when I am given the chance to be. I do not doubt it. Come, let me show you to a room. You look like you could use a proper rest in a proper bed. The room Sarah showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the vegetable garden behind the house. It was more sanctuary than Willa had known in 2 years, and she felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them. There now, Sarah said gently, patting her shoulder. You cry if you need to. God knows you have earned the right. When you are ready, come downstairs and we will talk about your duties. But for now, rest. You are safe here. Willa lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, and fell into an exhausted sleep before Sarah had even closed the door. She woke hours later to darkness and the sound of cicadas singing outside her window. For a moment, panic seized her as she forgot where she was, and she sat up gasping, expecting to see Marcus's face looming over her in the shadows. But the room remained empty and peaceful, and gradually her racing heart slowed. There was a soft knock at the door. Willa, dear, are you awake? Sarah's voice gentle and patient. Yes, madam. Sarah entered with a lamp in one hand and a tray in the other. I thought you might be hungry when you woke. I brought some soup and bread. Willa ate gratefully, and as she did, Sarah settled into the room's single chair and spoke of practical matters. The arrangement for her stay, the housework that would be required, the rhythms and routines of the boarding house. It was soothing to talk of normal things, of laundry schedules and meal preparations, as if Willa's life had not just been completely upended. Frank will come by tomorrow to discuss what happens when your husband returns, Sarah said carefully. But tonight, just rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges soon enough. Willa spent the next 3 days falling into the routines of the boarding house, learning Sarah's particular ways with the kitchen and the laundry. There were 5 other boarders, all men who worked in town at various trades, and they treated Willa with respectful distance, perhaps sensing her fragility or perhaps warned by Sarah to give her space. Frank stopped by each afternoon, ostensibly to check on Mrs. Fletcher, but always finding time to speak with Willa as well. He brought her a few of her personal belongings from the house she had shared with Marcus, retrieved during official visits to ensure the property was secure. Each time he came, they would sit on the porch in the cooling evening air and talk about small things, safe things. The weather, the town gossip, the progress of the cattle drives. But underneath the mundane conversation, something else was growing. Willa found herself watching for Frank's arrival, found her heart lifting when she caught sight of his tall figure walking down the street. She told herself it was simply gratitude, simply the natural affection anyone would feel for their rescuer. But late at night, alone in her small room, she admitted the truth to herself. She was developing feelings for Frank Ramsey that went far beyond gratitude. It was dangerous and foolish and completely inappropriate. She was still a married woman, bound by law and custom to Marcus Owens regardless of his cruelty. But her heart seemed not to care about such practicalities. Frank, for his part, maintained a careful propriety in all their interactions, never overstepping the bounds of friendship and professional concern. But sometimes Willa would catch him looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch, something warm and tender and full of unspoken promise. On the fourth day, word came that the cattle drive was returning early. They would be in Del Rio by nightfall. Frank came to the boarding house in the late afternoon, his expression grim. "Marcus will be back soon," he said, finding Willa in the kitchen where she was helping Sarah prepare dinner. "I want you to stay here, stay safe. I will go meet the drive and have a conversation with your husband before he has a chance to come looking for you." Fear clutched at Willa's chest, the old familiar terror of Marcus's rage. "He will be furious when he finds out I am gone. He will think I have shamed him in front of the whole town." "He shamed himself when he decided to starve his wife," Frank replied firmly. "This ends tonight, Willa. One way or another, it ends." He left before she could argue further, and Willa stood at the kitchen window watching his retreating form, her hands twisted in her apron. "That man cares for you," Sarah observed quietly from behind her. More than is probably wise given the circumstances. Willa did not bother to deny it. "I care for him too. God help me, but I do." "God might help you more than you think," Sarah said. "These things have a way of working themselves out in time." The hours that followed were agony. Willa tried to focus on her work, on setting the table for dinner and serving the boarders, but her mind was across town where Frank was confronting Marcus. She imagined 100 terrible scenarios, each worse than the last. It was fully dark when Frank finally returned, and Willa knew immediately that something significant had happened. His face was set in hard lines and there was blood on his knuckles. "Is he dead?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "No," Frank said. "Though God knows he deserves to be, but he is in jail and he will stay there for a good long while if I have anything to say about it." He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, suddenly looking exhausted. Sarah poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, and he accepted it gratefully. "What happened?" Willa asked, sitting down across from him. Frank took a long drink of coffee before answering. "I met the drive at the edge of town and asked to speak with Marcus privately. When I told him you were no longer living in his house and why, he tried to claim it was his right as your husband to discipline you as he saw fit. When I told him that starving a woman was not discipline but attempted murder, he took a swing at me." "Oh no," Willa breathed. "Oh yes." "And I might have hit him back a bit harder than was strictly necessary for self-defense." Frank flexed his bruised knuckles. "He is currently in a cell, charged with assault on a peace officer and with spousal cruelty. Judge Henderson will be in town next week for the circuit court and Marcus will stand trial." Willa felt dizzy with the implications. "What will happen to him?" "That depends on the judge. Could be jail time, could be a fine, could be he just orders Marcus to leave you alone and get out of town. Either way, you are done with him. I will make sure of it." And if the judge does not see it that way, if he says a man has the right to govern his household as he wishes, Frank's expression hardened. Then I will personally escort Marcus out of Del Rio and make it clear he is never to return. One way or another, Willa, you are free of him. I promise you that. The week that followed was strange and dreamlike. Willa continued her work at the boarding house, falling into the comfortable rhythms of a life that felt almost normal. Frank visited daily, bringing updates on Marcus's situation, and gradually revealing more of himself in the process. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, that he had lost his parents to cholera when he was 14, that he had worked his way west doing odd jobs before settling in Del Rio 5 years ago. He had been deputy sheriff for 3 years, working under an aging sheriff who was content to let Frank handle most of the actual law enforcement. "You ever think about leaving?" Willa asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Going somewhere else, starting fresh." "I used to," Frank admitted. "When I first came here, I thought of Del Rio as just another stop on the way to somewhere better. But then I realized that somewhere better was not a place, it was a life. And I have built a good life here. I have work that matters, people who depend on me, a community I care about." He glanced at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "Though lately I have been thinking that a good life could be even better with the right person to share it with." Willa's heart hammered in her chest. "Frank, I am still married." "I know, and I am not asking you for anything you cannot give. I am just saying that when this is over, when you are truly free, I would like the chance to court you properly, if you would allow it." Willa thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the scandal it would cause, all the complications it would bring. But when she looked at Frank's honest face, at the hope and tenderness in his eyes, she found she could not bring herself to refuse. "I would like that," she said softly. "Very much." Frank smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his weather-worn features. He reached out and took her hand, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, not speaking, just holding on to each other and the promise of what might come. Judge Henderson arrived in Del Rio on a Tuesday, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a reputation for fairness tempered with common sense. The trial was held in the town's small courthouse, a adobe building that also served as the mayor's office and community meeting hall. Willa sat in the front row with Sarah on one side and Frank on the other, her hands clenched tight in her lap. Marcus stood before the judge in his dusty trail clothes, still wearing the bruises from his fight with Frank. He had not looked at Willa once since entering the courtroom. The charges were read, and Frank gave his testimony about finding Willa collapsed in the street and about Marcus's subsequent confession that he had locked the pantry and left her without food for days. Dr. Walsh, the town physician, testified that Willa had shown clear signs of starvation and dehydration when he examined her at Frank's request. Finally, Judge Henderson called Willa to the witness stand. Her legs shook as she walked forward, and she kept her eyes fixed on Frank's encouraging nod rather than looking at Marcus. "Mrs. Owens," the judge said gently, "I need you to tell me in your own words about your marriage to Marcus Owens." Willa took a deep breath and began to speak. She told the truth she had hidden for 2 years, about the escalating cruelty, the locked pantries, the accusations and the rages. She spoke of being isolated from neighbors and friends, of being forbidden to work or earn her own money, of the growing fear that had become the constant backdrop of her days. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Marcus had the grace to look at the floor. Judge Henderson removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Willa suspected he used when he needed time to think. Finally, He replaced them and looked at Marcus with an expression of profound disgust. "Mr. Owens," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "I have been a judge for 20 years, and in that time I have seen men commit all manner of sins and crimes. But there is something particularly cowardly about a man who abuses the woman who has pledged her life to him, who uses his physical strength and legal authority to torment someone who should be under his protection. You are a disgrace to the institution of marriage and to the basic standards of human decency." Marcus started to speak, but the judge cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I am not finished. While the assault on Deputy Ramsey could carry jail time, I am more concerned with the systematic cruelty you have inflicted on your wife. Therefore, I am issuing the following judgment. First, you will pay a fine of $200 for assault and spousal cruelty. Second, you are hereby ordered to grant Mrs. Willa Owens a divorce on grounds of cruelty, with no contest and no claim to any property or assets she may possess now or in the future. Third, you are banished from Del Rio and the surrounding county. If you are found within 50 miles of this town after sunset tonight, you will be arrested and serve 6 months in jail. Do you understand?" Marcus's face had gone purple with rage, but faced with the judge's stern glare and Frank's steady presence at the back of the courtroom, he managed a tight nod. "Good. I will draw up the divorce papers this afternoon, and they will be final immediately. Mrs. Owens, you are free to resume your maiden name if you wish, and you are released from all marital obligations to this man. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that, Willa's marriage was over. She sat frozen in her seat as people began to file out of the courtroom, unable to quite believe what had just happened. Frank appeared at her side, offering his hand to help her stand. "You are free," he said simply, "truly free." Willa looked up at him, at this good man who had saved her life and given her back her future, and felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Thank me by being happy," Frank replied. "That is all I have ever wanted." Marcus left town that afternoon, taking his horse and his wounded pride with him. Willa watched from the boarding house window as he rode past, heading south toward Mexico perhaps, or west toward California. She felt nothing as he disappeared into the distance, just a strange, weightless feeling, as if a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Without the constant fear and hunger that had defined her married life, Willa began to remember who she had been before Marcus, and to discover who she might become after. She continued her work at the boarding house, and Sarah began to teach her the business side of running such an establishment, talking about maybe taking Willa on as a partner eventually. And Frank courted her with an old-fashioned propriety that was as charming as it was refreshing. He brought her wildflowers picked from the prairie, took her on chaperoned picnics with Sarah along to preserve propriety, and sat with her on the boarding house porch in the evenings talking about their hopes and dreams for the future. 3 months after her divorce, on a cool November evening when the heat of summer had finally broken, Frank asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the creek at the edge of town, watching the water flow silver in the moonlight. Frank had been quieter than usual all evening, and Willa could sense he was working up to something. "Willa," he finally said, turning to face her fully, "I know we have not been courting for very long, and I know you have been through something terrible that would make any woman cautious about marriage. But I need you to know that every day I spend with you, I fall more in love with you. You are brave and kind and strong, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you make me. Will you marry me?" Willa felt her heart swell with an emotion so big it seemed to fill her entire chest. She thought about the girl she had been 2 years ago, so eager to marry that she had ignored all the warning signs about Marcus's character. She thought about the woman she had become, hardened by cruelty but not broken by it. And she thought about the woman she wanted to be, the woman she could be with a man like Frank at her side. "Yes," she said, and watched joy break across his face like sunrise. "Yes, I will marry you." Frank kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Willa felt something inside her that had been locked tight for years finally open. This was what marriage should be, she realized. Not ownership and control, but partnership and love. They married in January of 1882 in the small church at the center of Del Rio. Sarah served as Willa's attendant, and the sheriff stood up for Frank. Most of the town turned out for the ceremony, genuinely happy to see the deputy marry the woman he had saved. Willa wore a dress of deep blue that Sarah had helped her sew, and Frank wore his best suit with his silver star pinned proudly to his chest. As they stood before the minister and spoke their vows, Willa felt the ghosts of her first marriage finally laid to rest. These vows were real, spoken with full understanding and genuine love. When Frank promised to honor and cherish her, she believed him with her whole heart. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a neat white structure with a porch and a yard big enough for a garden. Frank continued his work as deputy, and Willa kept her partnership with Sarah at the boarding house, the two women working together to build a thriving business. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Frank would leave for work each morning with a kiss and a promise to be home for dinner. Willa would spend her days at the boarding house, cooking and cleaning and managing the accounts. In the evenings, they would sit together on their porch, talking about their days and making plans for the future. It was not a life without challenges. There were difficult days when Willa would be overwhelmed by memories of her time with Marcus, when she would flinch at sudden movements or panic, when Frank raised his voice in frustration over some small thing. But Frank was patient with her, gentle when she needed gentleness and steady when she needed strength. Slowly, the wounds of her first marriage began to heal. One spring evening, a year after their wedding, Willa realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week to be sure, then went to see Dr. Walsh, who confirmed what she had suspected. She was pregnant. Willa felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Joy and fear tangled together. Memories of the child she had hoped to have with Marcus mingling with excitement about carrying Frank's baby. When she told him that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction, Frank's expression transformed into pure delight. "A baby," he breathed, gathering her carefully into his arms. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Willa asked, needing to hear the words. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Frank replied, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have given me everything I ever wanted, Willa. A home, a marriage built on love and respect, and now a child. I am the most fortunate man in Texas." Their son was born in December of 1882, a healthy baby boy with Frank's dark hair and Willa's gray eyes. They named him James, after Frank's father, and from the moment Willa held him, she felt a fierce protective love unlike anything she had ever experienced. Frank was a devoted father, taking to the role with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. He would walk the floor with James when the baby cried at night, singing off key lullabies in his deep voice. He changed diapers without complaint and spent hours just watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny miracle they had created. As James grew from infant to toddler, the little house on the edge of town filled with laughter and love. Willa's partnership with Sarah continued to thrive, and eventually they opened a second boarding house on the other side of Del Rio, this one catering specifically to families passing through on their way west. Frank was promoted to sheriff when his predecessor retired, a position that came with more responsibility but also more respect and better pay. He used the extra money to expand their house, adding a second bedroom and a larger kitchen. When James was 3, Willa became pregnant again. This time it was a girl, born in the spring of 1886 with blonde hair and her father's creek water eyes. They named her Rose, and she was as spirited and bold as her brother was thoughtful and gentle. The years passed in a blur of sweet domesticity. Frank and Willa's love deepened with time, growing from the passionate intensity of new love into something stronger and more enduring. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs and fears and joys. They fought sometimes, as all couples do, but they fought fair and always made up before bed. Willa never forgot the dark days of her first marriage, but they became more distant with time, like a nightmare that loses its power in the light of day. She used her experience to help other women in difficult situations, quietly providing support and resources to those who needed it. Several times over the years, Frank would arrest men for spousal cruelty, and Willa would take their wives into her boarding houses, giving them the same chance at a new life that she had been given. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Willa back to the creek where he had proposed. Their children were with Sarah for the evening, and they had the rare luxury of being alone together under the stars. "You remember the day I found you in the street?" Frank asked, holding her close as they sat by the water's edge. "Every detail," Willa replied. "Though sometimes it feels like it happened to a different person. I was so broken then, so lost." "You were never broken," Frank said firmly. "Hurt, yes. Trapped, absolutely, but never broken. You had the strength to accept help when it was offered and the courage to build a new life. That takes a kind of strength most people never have to find." Willa turned to look at her husband, this good man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life." "You have thanked me every day for 10 years, just by being happy, by building this life with me. Watching you bloom into the woman you were meant to be has been the greatest privilege of my life." They kissed then, with all the passion of new lovers and all the comfort of old friends, and Willa felt grateful beyond words for the unexpected gift of this second chance at love. More years passed, marked by the milestones of family life. James grew into a serious young man who wanted to follow his father into law enforcement. Rose became a teacher, fierce and compassionate in equal measure. The boarding houses continued to prosper, and Willa's reputation as a businesswoman and advocate for vulnerable women spread throughout the county. In 1895, when Willa was 42 years old, she received word that Marcus had died in California, his body found in a rooming house with a bottle of whiskey and a lifetime of bad choices as his only companions. She felt only a distant pity when Frank told her the news, a sadness for the waste of a human life but no real grief. "Are you all right?" Frank asked, watching her carefully. "I am fine," Willa replied and meant it. "He stopped being real to me a long time ago. He is just a shadow now, and even that shadow is gone." Frank pulled her close, and they stood together in their comfortable kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together. Photographs of their children hung on the walls, Rose's drawings from childhood mixed with James's school certificates. The kitchen table, scarred from years of family meals, held a vase of wildflowers Frank had picked that morning. "I love you," Frank said, as he did every day. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Willa replied, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them. "You gave me everything. You gave me myself back." They grew old together, gray hairs and laugh lines replacing the youth they had worn when they first met. Frank eventually retired as sheriff, passing the star to James, who wore it with the same dedication his father had shown. Rose married a teacher from San Antonio and gave them grandchildren who filled the house with noise and joy. On summer evenings, Willa and Frank would sit on their porch as they had done for decades, holding hands and watching the sun set over Del Rio. Sometimes they would talk, sharing memories and observations. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. One such evening, when Frank was 73 and Willa 70, he turned to her with a smile. "Do you remember the day I found you in the street and told you to come sit at my table? How could I forget? It was the day my life began again." "I knew right then that you were going to be important to me," Frank said. "The moment I caught you, felt you in my arms, I knew. I tried to tell myself it was just concern for a fellow citizen, but my heart knew better." "Love at first sight," Willa teased gently. "Something like that. Or maybe not love yet, but the recognition of a soul that could love mine if given the chance." Willa rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and leather and the faint smell of the horses from the stable. "You gave me more than a meal that day. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. You gave me a reason to believe that life could be good, that I deserved kindness and love." "You always deserved those things," Frank said. "I just made sure you got them." They sat together as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Two people who had found each other in the midst of suffering and built something beautiful from the ruins of Willa's first marriage. Their love story had not been simple or easy, but it had been real and lasting and true. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1910, at the age of 75. Willa mourned him deeply, but not despairingly, knowing that they had been blessed with nearly 3 decades of genuine happiness together. She lived another 7 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them evidence of the love she and Frank had shared. When Willa died in 1917, at the age of 77, she was buried next to Frank in the Del Rio Cemetery. Their graves sat beneath an old oak tree, and on the shared headstone their children had inscribed a simple epitaph that told the story of their love. "Two souls, one heart, forever bound by love and grace." In the end, Willa's story was not about the cruelty she had endured, but about the love she had found. It was about second chances and the courage to accept help when it was offered. It was about a cowboy with kind eyes who had seen a woman collapsing in the street and decided to be her salvation. It was about choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and building a life worth living from the ashes of a life that had nearly destroyed her. The people of Del Rio remembered Frank and Willa Ramsey for generations, their story becoming a kind of local legend. They spoke of the deputy who had stood up to cruelty, and the woman who had found the strength to start over. They told their children about the importance of kindness, about standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves, about the redemptive power of love given freely and received with grace. And on summer evenings, when the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold, people would sometimes pause in their work and think about Frank and Willa sitting on their porch, holding hands and watching the world go by. They would think about how a simple act of compassion, an invitation to come sit at a table and share a meal, had blossomed into one of the great love stories of Del Rio. They would remember that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, that heroes do not always wear capes or ride in dramatically at the last moment. Sometimes a hero is just a good man who sees someone in need and decides to help, no questions asked, no reward expected. And in remembering Frank and Willa, the people of Del Rio learned to be a little kinder, a little braver, a little more willing to extend a hand to those who were suffering. They learned that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that it was never too late to start over, and that sometimes the best way to honor those who came before was to live with the same courage and compassion they had shown. That was the legacy of Frank and Willa Ramsey, a legacy written not in grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in the quiet accumulation of days spent loving each other well. It was a legacy of breakfast tables and front porch conversations, of children raised with kindness, of a community made better by their presence. It was the kind of legacy that matters most, the kind that echoes through generations and reminds people of what is possible when two souls find each other and decide to build something beautiful together. In the end, Willa's story was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. She had been brought to the brink of death by one man's cruelty, but had been saved by another man's compassion. She had lost everything and gained it all back, not through dramatic heroics, but through the simple, steady accumulation of good days and genuine love. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever lies beyond this mortal world, Frank and Willa are sitting together still, holding hands and watching the sunset, content in the knowledge that they had loved each other well and built a life that mattered. That is all any of us can hope for in the end, to love and be loved, to make the world a little better for our presence, and to leave behind something worth remembering. Their story began with a woman who had not eaten in days and a cowboy who said, "Come sit at my table now." And it ended with a love that lasted beyond death, a family that carried their values forward, and a community that was better for having known them. That is the kind of story that deserves to be told, the kind of love that deserves to be celebrated, and the kind of life that deserves to be remembered.